Okay. Yeah, since we're counting down, I will just give a brief overview. So the link you're seeing on the screen is a fundraiser for Cassandra the lesbian, who is joining us and will be moderating the chat as well. Sister who is in Gaza, and Gadir's family with them also in Gaza. So this fundraiser is through Gadir's sister Yasmin, who is in Belgium, so that's why the cost is in euros. And if you click on the link or type in that link, you will be able to read a bit more about the situation and understand the gravity of the need. And I hope that even if you just have a little bit to give, a little bit can add up a lot. It doesn't have to be big numbers, because if even just several people donated just like 5, 10, 15, it all adds up, and it's all towards someone, and I shouldn't say someone, several people who really, really need it right now. So yeah, I'm going to leave that link up on the screen while we talk, and you can check that out at any time. And if you do donate, please feel free to share that you've done so. You don't have to share the amount. You can just say that, yeah, I was able to do this, and I will thank you. And it'll give me motivation to keep reading more. So if you need an extra boost as a reason to do that. But I just hope that we can draw attention to this fundraiser that is in the process of being vetted, as confirmed just today. So with that, I will begin. This story that we're reading tonight is Three Trees to Midnight by Trick Weeks. I will remind everybody that Weeks goes by they, them pronouns. So even if you're, criticizing Weeks for, in my opinion, some poor choices in this story, I am not a fan of this story. I'll say that up front. Please be respectful of their pronouns. So let's begin with the worst opening ever. Marian of Ventus didn't know much about Kunari. I say this is the worst opening ever because it really spoils a twist that is to come. It speaks of Miriam's privilege. Like, Ventus is literally closer to Saharon than Minrathous. It was formerly known as Coronus. If you look on the outdated map, you'll see it labeled as Coronus, but it's known as Ventus now in the lore. So we're talking about a person who didn't know much about Kunari despite literally living next door to them. Until last week, they had been an annoyance, something young soldiers went off to fight while everyone else grumbled about the taxes they paid to defend the Imperium from the savage Oxmen. Yeah, just an awful person right off the bat. I know that it's the norm in Thedas to have prejudice against Kunari and see them as this, evil force of foreign nature, but I feel like this compounding with other racism that Marian talks about, it just really nails home this guy is an asshole. That ignorance had ended in a blast of cannon fire, and in less than a day, Ventus, jewel of the Tevinter Imperium, had fallen. The Kunari had cut down anyone wearing armor. Those who were unarmed, they had herded into different groups. The women, children, and elderly had quickly returned to their homes. The mages had screamed horribly as alchemical concoctions killed their minds and left them as empty husks who stumbled along, sweeping dirt from the streets with awful vacant stares, their beautiful golden-trimmed robes dragging the dirt behind them. The way this describes Kamek, which is what this is, it sounds a lot like Tranquility, does it not? The only thing is, Kamek, as it's later discussed in this specific story, if given at a lower dose, is reversible. So just another nail home that Tranquility really isn't necessary, even if you want to try and justify the horrible act of, mind control, essentially. You could still do it in a way that's reversible. The men, however, had been put into work camps. This afternoon's sun was blinding after days down in the hold of the Canary ship. Marion squinted, his chained legs rattling as he shuffled along the line of prisoners. The sandy beach gave way to grass, and shortly thereafter to forest, where a dense cloud of black foliage hunkered over the twisting green of tree trunks as though preparing to lash out at the weeds below. I know I stumbled on my words, but it was just because I was reflecting. I really like this description of the Arlathan forest because it makes it feel like the forest itself is a character part of the story rather than just a location. Yeah, I like that. I will admit I like that. Vishanti Kafas, Marion muttered. The Canary bastards had taken them to the outskirts of the Arlathan forest. The last of the prisoners were off the ship now, and shirtless Canary roared at them to line up, waving swords that looked like they could chop through a horse with no appreciable difficulty. Finally, a Canary even larger than the others stepped forward. His face was twisted into a scowl, his gray skin painted gold with red slashes, and his armor was a mass of knotted rope twisting around jutting spikes. I do wish we could learn a little bit more about the symbolism presented in this story for each pattern of Vitar painted on the Canary faces. It describes these associations with different roles, but it doesn't go into further detail. And we only get a handful of examples, but I'm very intrigued by this because it almost mirrors like Valisline, you could even say. Like there's no religious association, but it is like stamping on your forehead, like this is your job. I guess in that way, it's more comparable to like the casteless tattoos, maybe you could say. His horns were jagged and swept forward to either side of his face like a low helmet. One horn had been chopped off, probably in battle, and replaced with steel. This is also interesting, and I know I keep interrupting, but that's kind of the point of doing this commentary and not just a plain read through. Because I want to talk about this, the story that we're reading. I want to, provide something more than just the story itself, because that also would be like super illegal, I'm pretty sure. Anyway, because the word of the developers is Canary associate a lack of horns with danger, and supposedly some even intentionally shave them off to be intimidating. So I wonder if this character that we're about to be introduced to as Bastar really did lose his horn in battle, or if this is just like a style play. Because judging by the personality of this guy, I would not be surprised if he intentionally chopped off his horn to show off. Boss, he called, his deep voice sending a shudder through Marion's gut. That is what you are, boss. Things. You do not know what is and is not. You need the guidance of the Kyun to learn. How generous of you, muttered the prisoner who had been in front of Marion, a tall man whose accent placed him as from the south. Marion kept his head down. If the Canary were going to single out someone for backtalk, it wouldn't be him. I am Bastar, keeper of Bas, the Canary leader went on. I know this is called out, but why would you call your character Bastar and expect us to take this character seriously? I'm sorry. I need to recompose myself. You belong to me now. Work and you live. Resist and you die. Run, a slow smile twisted across his face, and you belong to the Huntsmaster. He gestured at another Canary warrior, this one dressed in lighter armor, strips of leather and drake scale bound by crisp red ropes. This is also like very representative of the Canary armor we see in Inquisition, so I can like picture it in my head quite well. But I feel like there's something to be said about like the Orientalism in the design of the Canary armor. I'm probably not the best person to talk about that in detail, so I won't go into it. But I would be interested in reading that from a perspective of someone personally affected by that kind of appropriation and bigotry. So if anybody knows some good posts about that, please feel free to Link them to me. His face was painted with stripes of black and white. His cold stare swept down the line of prisoners as Bastar went on. Run, and he will track you down, and you will suffer as the Magus of Ventus suffered. Mirian felt the panic rising up in him and fought it down with a conscious effort, clearing his mind and keeping his body still. When he was certain he could look up without giving himself away, Bastar had moved on. You will take axes, you will cut the trees. Prove you are useful and obedient, and you will one day earn a place in the Kyun. Bastar looked across the line of prisoners, then let out a snort. Come. Mirian glanced nervously at the huntsmaster, but the Qunari tracker had walked back to the ship. Qunari guards came forward, carrying massive chests between them, and dropped them into the sand. As Mirian drew closer, he saw that the chests were filled with wood axes, heavy and clumsy, sharp enough to fell a tree, but too clumsy to be much use in a fight. As someone who has wounded myself with a wood-splitting axe before, that's bullshit. Axes are plenty dangerous, even wood-splitting axes. You have to be careful with them if they are particularly sharp and new. Anyway, a story for another time, perhaps. Each prisoner got one, and as he did, he was released from the long prisoner's chain. The prisoners weren't released fully, though. Before they were freed from the prisoner's chain, they were shackled into pairs. Each pair connected by the ankle by a length of chain no longer than Mirian's forearm. Only a pair of circus performers could run while tied together like that. I kind of feel like this is a missed opportunity to call back to later in the story. No spoilers for those who are hearing it for the first time. Before Mirian knew it, he and the prisoner in front of him were at the front of the line. The other prisoner stepped forward, back straight and shoulders square under his brown laborer's tunic. His hair was silver, Mirian noted, and revised the other prisoner's age up a few decades. Right, said the prisoner, holding out a calloused hand to the guard standing over the chest of axes. Off to work, then. And as he turned, Mirian saw the points of the man's ears. An elf. That explained everything. Mirian's mouth twisted into a sneer as the Qunari handed the elf the axe. Any elf in Ventus would have been a slave, so of course he'd have no loyalty to the Imperium, no understanding of what Tevinter had protected him from all these years. What the fuck, bro? I truly hate this guy so much. What exactly does he think Tevinter protected the elves from again? Like, what? He'd probably laughed as the soldiers had been cut down, the mages poisoned, happy to trade one master for another. Filthy knife-ear, Mirian muttered, glaring at the elf, unaware that the words had worked themselves free from his mouth until the elf and the Qunari stared at him. The elf was the first to recover. Lazy Shem isn't used to working, he said with an easy smile. Not with those soft hands of his. Chain me to another elf, so I don't embarrass the poor man. You'd embarrass me with your knife-eared stupidity, Mirian snapped, and then stab me as soon as my back was turned. Quiet, the guard roared. There will be no disruptions. He spoke slowly. Most of the Qunari didn't speak trade well, Mirian remembered. Then chain me to a man, not this knife-ear, Mirian said, glaring at the silver-haired elf. Probably faster for everyone if you just do it, the elf added. The humans of Ventus are an ugly lot, and they only care for their own. The guard hesitated for a moment, but then a booming voice startled them all. No. They all turned to see Bastar stomping over from the line of new prisoners. Thank you, Falsey Plays. Thank you so much. Great on you. There were prison ships landing all along the beach. He glared at the guard, who shrank back and then smiled at Mirian and the elf. The Bas must learn. There are no more elves, no more humans. There are only Bas, who must work to prove themselves worthy of serving the Kyun. He turned to the guard. Chain them together. Let them learn to work as one. The fact that this story treats these two characters as being equally insulting to one another is so infuriating. Mirian is literally using a racial slur in-universe, a racial slur, against Strife. This is Strife, by the way. We'll come to know his name in a little bit. And all Strife does is shoot back, and we're supposed to pretend that that erases the power imbalance. Strife is just defending himself. Or, like, you could argue that he's going on the offense as a defense, but there is a power imbalance here. And that is not considered. And it really frustrates me, and I'll get into this later more when it's further developed, but it really reeks of someone who is a white settler in Turtle Island, or specifically Canada in Weeks' case. And as an Indigenous person who is living in Mi'kma'ki, which is under occupation by Canada, it frustrates me so much. I agree. Marion is one of the worst characters in the book, for real. Like, it wouldn't bother me as much if it wasn't for the fact that he is painted as sympathetic as the story goes on. Like, oh, please feel bad for this poor guy. We misjudged him. Fuck no. All right, back to the story. As you say, Bastard, the guard murmured, and brought out a chain. He clapped one cuff around the elf's ankle, snapping it shut, and then turned to Marion. Helpless, Marion stepped forward. The cuff was cold on his right leg, pinching his tender skin as it snapped shut. As you say, Bastard, the elf said with an obedient smile, and the big Kenori looked at him, then nodded and strode off, ready to give orders to another line. Marion let out a shaky breath as the guard undid the prisoner's chain and slapped a wood-cutting axe in his hand. He glared at the elf. You could have gotten us killed. What's that, Shem? The elf asked, his face a mask of innocence. These old knife ears aren't as sharp as they used to be, and sometimes I hear things wrong. Go now and cut the trees, the guard said, pointing to the forest. I wish we actually got an explanation as to why the hell the Kunari are even trying to deforest Arlethan. Why are they here? What are they doing? Like, will we find out in the Veilguard, or is this just a random one-off example of weird deforestation? Marion saw that the other paired prisoners were already at the edge of the wall of green, hacking away. Work well, and you will eat well. The elf started off, and Marion stumbled as the chain jerked against his ankle. The elf looked back. Come on, Shem, he said with a little grin. Try to keep up. Marion and the elf found an awkward rhythm after a few strides, keeping pace so that two long legs chained together moved as one. Marion's legs were longer than the elf's, and he had to shorten his steps. I think Weeks forgot for a second that literally a few paragraphs above this, he said that Strife was taller. I guess you could maybe say that their proportions between their legs and the rest of their bodies is just different, but it paints a picture of Strife being the shorter one here and Strife being the taller one earlier. Maybe they are just after Arlethan because Magic Forest evils. I mean, they certainly treat it like that in the story about how haunted it is. So maybe they are just like, this forest is full of evil magic, let's get rid of it. There's much to be desired in the Kunari depiction of this story, because while they do address the fact that these specific group of Kunari are going against the Kyun, it still leaves up to interpretation that they are just these big bad guys who are scary foreigners. Yeah. You keep running your mouth like that, you'll get killed, Marion said as they made their way across the grass, the chain hissing between them. You're still a slave, idiot, only now you're a slave to beasts that will kill you as soon as look at you. I fail to see the difference between the Kunari and Tevinter in that regard, Marion, but okay. Whatever you say, bud. What would you know about it? The elf asked. His voice wasn't friendly anymore, and when Marion looked over, he saw that the elf was looking ahead at the forest. Forges of Orthanc? I'm not familiar with that. Cassandra the Lesbian, if you want to expand on that in chat, please feel free. I'm curious, whatever that is. You're no laborer, whatever tunic you wear. Marion's breath hitched, and his grip tightened around the axe he carried. You don't know what you're talking about, elf. Strife, the elf said. What? There's more than one elf around here. Call me Strife. Oh, Lord of the Rings. Okay, I'm sorry. I admit I'm not very familiar with Lord of the Rings. I know that's like a curse to admit, but I tried to get into them when I was too young to really appreciate them, I think. Um, so maybe someday I'll revisit it. I don't know. I understand that there is some racism in the franchise, but that can be said about Dragon Age too, so that doesn't mean that there's not plenty of enjoyment to be found as well. I'm not going to sit here and diss Lord of the Rings when I'm a Dragon Age fan, that's for sure. Kenari being the Isengard, aka evil industrious, destroying natural beauty. Yeah, you could argue that, like, the idea of these people coming in and, like, destroying the natural beauty of the earth, but at the same time, they're depicted as, like, being righteous in doing so, I would argue. There's more than one Alpha here, call me Strife, and I know what I'm talking about better than you, I'd wager. Strife, if that was what he wished to call himself, still wasn't looking at Mirian, squinting into the trees ahead of them. The loose tunic hides your belly, but those nice rounded forearms say that you haven't missed many meals, and you keep your head down out of fear, not habit. Mirian's jerked his hands back up into his sleeves. At least I keep my head down at all. They came to a stop as the grass thickened into waist-high weeds. On either side of them, other pairs of prisoners had already started chopping the trees, the dull thumps of their clumsy blows echoing through the air. It could have been intentional, it could have been a reference, true enough. What kind of stupid knife-ear calls the head guard a bastard? One who wants to know how much trade the head guard speaks, Strife smiled. Now we know. Enough to talk to us, not enough to get nuance. What kind of slave talks about nuance? Mirian snapped. Strife stepped to the tree closest to them, a blunt, ugly thing whose trunk was so thick that Mirian couldn't have reached his arms around it. Guards are watching, Shem. Probably want to start chopping. He stepped to the tree and swung his axe with casual strength, his blade biting into the bark. Mirian, elf. There's more than one Shem around here. He stepped up, looked at the tree a bit uncertainly, hefted his axe, and swung. The blade hit at an angle with a jolt that sent pins and needles up Mirian's arms, and he winced, dropping his axe. As it thudded into the soft turf, Strife burst out laughing. Now there's a man who's never done a day's hard work in his life. What were you, Mirian, before you put on those laborer's clothes to hide from the Konari? A merchant? A petty noble? A meh? Mirian was moving before he realized, and his fist smacked Strife in the face. The elf stumbled back, his smile gone and his face going red with anger. Shut your mouth, you damned knife-ear. The smile was back a moment later, though the elf sank his axe into the soft turf and clenched his fists. Bud, I would have used that damn axe on this guy. Why don't you make me, Shem? Mirian came in with another swing, but this time the elf stepped into the blow and caught it into his tucked-up arms. It was like punching a thick rope, and Mirian's knuckles stung as he tried to step back, then stumbled as the chain reached its limit and nearly tripped him. I'm just picturing, like, I think it is creative to continue to reference the fact that they are chained together, because I feel like that changes the image I have in my head quite severely. I need a drink. Give me a sec. A sudden flash blossomed into pain, and Mirian staggered from a blow he hadn't even seen coming until it cracked across his face. Fuck yeah. In the distance, he heard yells and shouts, but Strife punched him in the gut, and Mirian sank to his knees as the air whooshed out of him. Isn't that just like Tevinter? Strife asked, standing over him. From the corner of his eye, Mirian saw that the Konari guard was approaching, with Bastar himself alongside him. Starting fights you can't finish. Take away your mages and your slaves and your blood magic, and you're all soft. The guard put a hand to his blade, but Bastar grabbed his hand. He looked at Mirian and smiled, then shook his head. Now, get up and work, Strife muttered, leaning in. Mirian lunged to his feet, ramming his head up and catching the surprised elf in the gut. As Strife staggered back, Miriam punched him again and again. No slave would talk like that, he said, breath hitching from effort as he brought his fists together to smash down on Strife's head. Whoever you are, you're a fraud. And as soon as I tell the guards... Strife's forearm, lean with long ropey muscle, slapped Miriam's fist aside, and his other fist hammered Miriam's chest just below the breastbone, stealing his breath. That long ropey muscle comment, I just realized it was repeated twice. I don't know if that was a miss or intentional to nail home or what, but maybe Weeks just likes to use the same descriptions more than once. As he stumbled, Strife caught him by the shoulder and leaned in. And people say I talk too much, he said, and then his other hand came in with a blow Miriam saw coming but couldn't do anything about, and the world exploded into a light and then darkness. As the world slid away, he heard the Qunari laugh. Yeah, I'd be laughing too. The Qunari guards had beaten Strife afterward, of course, but it had been a perfunctory beating to make sure he knew that there'd be more of the same if he talked back or caused more trouble. Later, the guards dragged him and the unconscious Miriam, still chained to him at the ankle, to a makeshift shelter where the prisoners were secured for the night. The guards came around with bowls filled with some sort of savory porridge, and Strife shoveled it into his mouth. Beside him, Miriam, finally awake, stiffed at the and grimaced. Not up to your fancy taste? Strife asked, shaking his head. Again, for all claims of Miriam not being anybody important later on, everything else certainly shows his privilege. Shut up, Miriam glared at him and then took a bite, chewing more than he needed to with a sour look on his face. That's the spirit. Eat hearty. You've got a full day's work ahead of you. The shelter was open on one side to let what passed for a breeze flow through and cool down the prisoners. Strife had a good view of the forest in the distance, the greens of the mossy trunks and heavy leaves darkened to black in the dim gray starlight. Just, again, a really pretty imagery of the Arlethan forest, though. As he ate, a pale white form separated itself from the forest. It was a Hala, antlers curling out like Tevinter sabers. It scented the air, one foreleg raised. When it saw Strife looking at it, the Hala tapped to the ground and slowly and deliberately 3 times. Strife shook his head and tapped his leg twice. The Hala ducked its head down. Then it turned back into the forest, gone as quickly as it had arrived. What was that? Strife looked over at Miriam, whose eyes were narrowed in thought. What was what? That deer. It was like you talked to it. Don't be silly, Strife said, smiling and cracking his knuckles. It was a deer. I shoot it off so I wouldn't end up in the porridge. No, those white ones are, Miriam thought. Hala. That's the Dale Shelves used to pull their wagons. That's what the Dale Shelves used to pull their wagons. Is it? Strife downed another spoonful of porridge. It wasn't bad once you started thinking of it as lukewarm stew after your brothers had already gotten to the good parts. This is something I never noticed before. Strife is mentioning that he has brothers, so I guess he has family? Like, that he left behind? Interesting. You know that's what it was, Miriam glared. Is that what you are? One of those Dalish bandits? Seems to me, Strife murmured, putting his bowl down. If I were chained to one of those Dalish elves, the ones willing to kill any Shem who looked at them wrong, I'd watch my mouth, because that Dalish elf might be here secretly, and he'd have to kill anyone who gave him away. Miriam opened his mouth, and then looked up guiltily as the guard stepped in front of them. Bowl, said the guard, a thick Qunari warrior who seemed to be made of scar tissue and knee skin. Now. Miriam looked at Strife. Strife raised an eyebrow, curling one hand into a fist where Miriam couldn't see. Miriam passed the bowl to the guard. Thank you for supper. Strife did the same, head down to hide his grin. Strife did the same, head down. Yeah. When the guard had moved to the next chained pair, he looked at Miriam. Thank you for the supper? That how the slaves talked in your manner? I didn't, Miriam caught himself, then glowered. Threaten me again, and you'll find my tone quite different. Don't worry. Strife lay down back on his pallet, using an arm as a makeshift pillow. Tomorrow I'll be away from there, and you'll be chained to someone new. Is that so? Miriam asked. Strife wasn't sure whether the man sounded angry or curious. Maybe both. You'll see. He shut his eyes and went to sleep with the ease of long practice sleeping in uncomfortable places. The canary came early in the morning to wake them all, and Strife pulled himself up, as did Marian, who was groaning and whining exactly like a good slave wouldn't. Whatever he'd been before the canary conquered Ventus, it hadn't involved getting up early. I must speak to Bastar, Strife said when the guards started to unchain them from the main chain line. There is other work I should be doing. The guard, a burly canary whose face looked like something a Teventer noble saved for his dogs at the end of the day, stared down at Strife. I really dislike the way the canary are all described in this story. It's only ever about how ugly and fearsome they are, and it often uses these animalistic words for them, and it really paints them as these caricatures, as not, actual people. You cut the trees. His hand moved slowly to the cudgel at his waist. Strife nodded. Yes, but Bastar will want me to do something else when I speak with him. Marian was shifting nervously beside him. The little man would already be trotting off with an axe he didn't know how to use, ready to make some new blisters. So would Strife if he'd been 30 years younger, looking up at a human guard. Hurry along so the guards didn't notice you, and maybe you'd get through the day without trouble. Vir Borasan, Strife thought, keeping his eyes on the ground. It was one of the first things the Dalish had taught him. The way of the bow. As the sapling bends, so must you. In yielding, find resilience. In pliancy, find strength. I'm a big fan of the Vir Borasan. I think it's a nice lore touch. The guard finally looked away. Come, he muttered, and walked off. Strife moved to keep up, and Miriam, with a muttered oath, also hurried to keep pace. What are you doing? The human muttered as they walked around the beach towards the Canary command tent. So much muttering. Don't worry. In a few minutes it won't be your problem. Bastar looked up from papers as the guard came in. When he saw Strife and Miriam, the smile he gave made Strife think of cracking knuckles. What do the boss need? Strife bowed. I am trained in alchemy. I worked with another elf. He called himself Thantiel. Bastar snorted, the gold paint on his face wrinkling, but he seemed interested despite himself. We do not know the names of the boss. He has marks upon his face, Strife touched his cheeks, like branches. He is also trained in alchemy. Together, we could help with more than cutting down trees. Ah, Bastar smiled, slow and easy. I know this boss. He also talked too much. Bend but never break, Strife remembered. Put me with him then, he said, and I will see to it he is quiet. Bastar looked at the guard and said something in the Qunari language. He turned to Strife. You will go to the other elf now. You will work as he does. His smile curved like a sword built for chopping. Just again, this really angry, descriptive terms used for the Qunari. I get that Bastar is a villain, but I just feel like even if by villain standards, the Qunari in this story are treated horribly. The Kyun is generous in fulfilling such requests. Strife ducked his head. My thanks, bastard. Marian's elbow dug into his side, but Marian was a whiny little man who wouldn't be Strife's problem for much longer. The guard led them across the beach towards another tent. Strife walked easily, watching as the other prisoners set to work with axes. The dull thumps of axes cutting into the woods were a little drumbeat under the constant foamy song of the ocean waves crashing against the shore. I don't like this, Marian muttered beside him. More muttering. This is another thing I'm picking up. Muttered is a very commonly used word in this story. I ought to count how much muttering there is. The Qunari don't change their minds like that. It took classes in this. They think everyone is born to do a certain job, and they don't just let you change your mind because you complain about it. You'd think that the Dalish would know this too if they're so invested in, this particular event. I'm trying to avoid spoiling the rest of the story. Wishing you'd let them know you were a scribe and not a laborer, Strife asked. Listen, you knife-eared idiot. You're causing trouble, and I don't want to get caught in it too. In a few minutes, we'll be chained to different people, and you'll never have to worry about me again, Strife said. In a few minutes, he'd be with Thanthiel, who'd signaled that he'd gotten his hands on the Qunari plans right after Ventus had fallen. Then he and Thanthiel would be off into the woods, waiting for a certain Hala to show up and guide them to safety. And in a few hours after that, he'd be singing old elven songs around a campfire, with Thanthiel warbling on the high notes and Irulan telling him that his accent was still terrible after all these years. They would laugh about the Qunari and about the idiot Tevinter men who'd never learned to stand up for themselves with blood magic and slaves to support them, and Strife would turn the shackles into a lovely decoration on his quiver. The guards opened the flap to the tent, and Strife and Mirian stepped inside, their chain clanking between them. The smell hit Strife first, hot lye and sweaty steam. As his eyes were adjusted, he realized that it was the stink of laundry. Robe's figures were dumping dirty clothes into vats and stirring the clothes around. Not the alchemists then, Strife realized. Their robes were different from the prisoner's uniform he'd gotten, and they didn't match each other either. Some robes were slim, while others hid the figures inside them behind voluminous folds. If they hadn't been mindlessly beating on the clothes, Strife would have thought the prisoners were chantry priests. "Where's Thanthiel?" Strife asked the guard, stepping into the room. Enclosed like this, it would be even easier for two of them to escape once the guards left. Strife looked around, squinting against the acrid steam, and saw a tall, slim figure who wasn't wearing robes. "Thant, that you?" Thanthiel didn't answer, and Strife went to him, Mirian trotting behind with awkward, jittery steps. "Wait," the human said. "Wait, this isn't right." Strife caught Thanthiel's shoulder and turned him around. Just FYI, this next part is quite horrifying. The eyes, the bright blue eyes of an elf who'd never known the pain and indignity of living in an alienage, met Strife's stare. They were dull and glassy and devoid of recognition. Thanthiel's mouth hung open, and he swayed in Strife's grasp, a vacant weight. The Valasleen tattooed across his face, a mark of adulthood for those raised in the Dalish clan, was the only remnant of Strife's friend. "The robes," Mirian hissed. "These were mages!" Strife turned and saw another worker. He was dragging a wooden hamper across the sand. Her eyes were flat and empty, just like Thanthiel's, but her robe, filthy and sodden as it was, still glittered at the hem with remnants of gold trim. What did the Qunari do to the mages they took prisoner? Strife tried to remember, and then cursed himself for a fool as the blow cracked across the back and brought him to his knees. "This boss also spoke too much," said the guard with a grisly smile, now standing before Strife. He held up a bottle filled with viscous brown liquid. "Now he is quiet. You work with him, you will be quiet too." A meaty hand clapped down on Strife's shoulder. Mirian tried to pull away, and the guard backhanded him, sending the man to the ground with a bloody nose. "Thant, help me!" Strife tried to stand, and the guard delivered a blow that set the world spinning and rattled Strife's teeth. A few feet away, Thanthiel stood impassively, watching without interest as the guard pried Strife's mouth open. The Qunari gave mages something, some kind of poison that left them like walking corpses. "So now you remember, bud. A little late there." Also, they do it to more than just mages. Like, we know that. Iron Bull himself says that, like, they use it to anyone who's considered too rebellious and can't be, quote-unquote fixed under the Qun. Yeah, this scene is really grim. Neo Fon-Mun, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Sorry about that. I agree. It's certainly an unsettling description of basically a lobotomy. He tried to knock the bottle away, but the guard's grip was like a vice. Another blow rocked Strife's head, and he gasped despite himself, and then the bottle pressed against his lips, and bitter liquid flooded his mouth. I feel like, yeah, they could have picked a different story to start off with. I personally think that the Horror of Hormak would have been also a bad start. I know some people have said, like, that's one of the better ones, and I agree. It's certainly one of the better written ones, but it is also very horrifying. If it was up to me, I would pick one maybe that kind of like lives in between, like maybe like an Old Crow's Old Tricks or something. Like that one's really fun, and it's a little. It has some dirty, gruesome parts, but not like extreme, not super unsettling. Anyway. Oh, it's Neofo. Hi. I recognize you now. A thunderclap shook the room, and Strife collapsed as the guard let go. He spat the liquid to the floor, coughing and shaking his head, and then looked up. The guard lay on the ground, smoke wafting from a hole in his chest. Beside Strife, Miriam stood with one hand pointed at the guard. Little tendrils of lightning curled around his shaking fingers. Miriam looked down at him. Do you know how hard I tried to hide? Strife opened his mouth, and then Miriam's fist rocked his jaw and left him seeing stars. This is your fault, Miriam snarled, and Strife felt hands close around his throat. The stupid knife ear had nearly gotten Miriam killed. The elf wasn't dead yet, but as good as. Miriam's fingers dug into the older man's throat, and his vision pounded red. Blood from his nose dripped down his shirt and onto the sandy ground. The knife ear was saying something, trying to, anyway, hands clutching at Miriam's wrists. Can you break the shackles? The elf gasped, and Miriam's fingers clenched even harder in his anger. If I could break the shackles, do you think I'd still be here? Then, the elf's voice was raggy to grasp, I hope you're ready to drag my body as you escape. Marion froze. A moment later, he snatched his hands back, and Strife hunched over, coughing. What do you mean, escape? He asked. Strife coughed a bit more, then smiled up at Marion, his face still red. How would you like to see the sights of the Arlethan Forest? Everyone knew Arlethan Forest was haunted, racked by old elven magic that lingered centuries later, dangerous and uncontrolled. I'm sorry, this reeks of like the old native curse trope to me. Oh, this land is cursed by magic. Indigenous people. We can't go anywhere near it. A monument to the elves' lack of discipline, an old magister had once told Marion. Marion thought that it sounded sad. Like, that's no better, bud. That's still, like, romanticizing your colonization. But today, it might mean freedom. Marion narrowed his eyes, wiping the blood from his face. His nose had finally stopped bleeding. You can get us away from the Qunari? Strife's grin showed some teeth. I can give you a better chance than you've got standing here. He stood and stepped towards the other elf, who still stood vacant-eyed and impassive before them. Marion followed as Strife grabbed the elf's shoulder. Thant, it's me. He slapped the elf's cheek. Come on! It's no use. Marion saw the naked pain in Strife's face and looked away. The Qunari drug. It's called Kamek. The Magisterium warned us about it. With as much as they've given them, I don't think they're ever coming back. This implies that it's possible to come back at a lower dose. There'd been a pamphlet about it. He'd read it over lunch before an afternoon playing wisp darts with friends. Jessica had said a nice empty mind sounded like a welcome relief after dealing with warding rituals all summer. Her sun-kissed skin had gleamed, her robes trimmed to leave her arms bare except for twinning serpent bracelets that glittered in the light. One of the laundry workers wore robes that left the arms bare. Her back was to him, but Marion saw little white lines against tan skin where bracelets would have sat on her arms. He refused to look at her face. If you've got a plan, we need to go now. Something in his voice got through to the elf, and Strife looked over, nodded, and then pulled the other elf close. Same clothes. Maybe. He pulled the elf's tunic open, pawed through it. "What are you doing?" Miriam demanded. "Do you want to end up a mindless husk?" "Vantiel snuck into your city to get information about the Qunari invasion." Where was I? I'm sorry, I went to another page and then I got lost. I should probably decrease the font size too. I'm not used to this application, sorry. Thant, yeah, okay. Right, Thant. Strife pulled his hand back with a small folded square of paper. Right, Thant. I'll carry it for you. He sighed, then reached up with both hands and cupped his friend's head and chin. No cure, you said? No coming back? Not when they're like this. I'm sorry. Yeah, Kindle sucks. Then I can at least give him peace, Strife sighed, and then twisted sharply. Marianne heard a crack. Andrew will guide your way, Thant, he murmured, as he lowered his friend's body to the ground. This is odd. You'd think he'd pray to Falandin, not Andrew. Maybe that's a mistake, or maybe Strife just has particular reverence for Andrew. If you want to live, Magister, you'll do as I do. If not for me, you'd be helping with the laundry right now, Marianne snapped. Strife knelt by the guard. No key. He pulled at the guard's axe, then let it drop with a wince and grabbed the cudgel instead. Bow would have been too much to ask for. He stood, right back of the tent. They shuffled over. Heading towards the tent just minutes ago, they had found a kind of rhythm. Now the chain jerked and danced between them, hitching their steps. Strife pulled up the tent flap, waving impatiently. Under. Miriam ducked down and stepped under, out onto the sandy beach. Strife followed, blinking at the cool, clear air. On one side, Miriam saw the ocean, waves frothing with a promise of sucking undertow. On the other, the impenetrable foliage of the Arlethan forest, with prisoners chopping ineffectually at its edges. What now? Miriam asked. Now we get to the forest, Strife said, and meet my clan. They started walking. I do hope we get to meet more of Strife's clan. Like, we meet Irulan, and we I guess in name meet Vantiel, but I want to know more about, like, the clan dynamics that make up the Veil Jumpers. I hope we meet them more in the Veil Guard for sure. Miriam fell in beside him, matching the elf's stride on a path behind the rows of working tents running parallel to the shore. So you are Dalish. Guess we were both hiding something, Magister, Strife said with a bitter chuckle. Why don't you have the tattoos? Miriam asked, like your friend back in the tent. Strife paused and looked back at the tent with a glare that promised violence. Thant was a good man. He deserved better than the Qunari gave him. So had Jessica, Marion mused, thinking of the figure back in the tent whose face he hadn't looked at. No one deserved to be a prisoner in their own mind, shackled by Qunari drugs just like the mages rendered tranquil in the south, denied even a quick death. Buddy, you were defending slavery yesterday. Okay. I guess it's totally unacceptable as long as it's not happening to, elves. Anyway, I could go on a lot longer on that topic. It was an awful effort without a staff, pulling little wisps of magic into order. He mouthed an old meditation chant that he'd learned at the university, guiding the magic with his will until it was ready, scratching at the edge of the barrier between the mortal world and the world of spirits, and then, sweating, he opened the path and let the energy through. I do like that description of casting magic, though. A ball of fire rolled wetly across the top of the tent, sooty flame curling out as the leather caught. The cries of alarm were immediate from the Qunari command tents. If anyone inside the laundry tent cried out, Miriam didn't hear it. What in Andrew's name did you do? Strife shout. Miriam met his look. I gave everyone in that tent a merciful end, like you did for your friend. You idiot! Strife grabbed him by the front of the tunic. They might not have noticed we were gone for an hour. Now they'll be on our heels. Marian shoved Strife away. You're saying we should have let them like that? I'm saying you shouldn't have started a big fire, Strife growled. Come on. He turned and started to run. Marian tried to follow, and then, tangled in the chain he'd forgotten was there, he tripped and fell into the sand. His hands and forearms stung from the impact, and the salty air nipped at his eyes. Using magic always left him feeling sensitive, as though everything were just a bit sharper. On your feet, Magister, Strife pulled on his shoulder, and Marian let himself be dragged up. Not a Magister, you damned knife-ear, he muttered, and then they were running. Inside foot, outside. Inside, outside, Strife muttered beside him. Oh my God, more muttering. I can't take that seriously. That word is going to be meaningless by the end of this story. Find the rhythm if you want to make it to the trees. Marian tried to find the rhythm, his blood pounding in his ears louder than the surf as they ran. The sand pulled at his sandals, and around them shouts of alarm came from both the Canary and the prisoners. Marian kept running, looking at his feet next to Strife's. The sand turned into scrubby grass beneath his sandals, and Marian heard a shout from his right, past Strife. He looked up to see one of the guards turning toward them, a thick-bodied Canary, short for the race, whose horns had been replaced with little dragon head caps. That sounds cool as hell. Dragon horns, please. Strife caught the guard in the face with the stolen cudgel, kicked him in the knee, and then smashed the cudgel across the back of his head. He might have done more, but Marian had still been running, and a moment later, the chain snapped taut between them with a painful wrench that sent Marian's face first into the turf again. Idiot mage, Strife hissed. He'd ended up on his back and rolled now to his feet, yanking the chain back up with another tug on Marian's leg. You didn't say we were stopping. Marian got to his hands and the knees, then pushed himself up, yanking on the chain as well. I didn't think I had to. Inside foot, go. Strife jerked into a run, and then Marian clumsily matched his stride. The chain between them hissed through the grass, jerking when it hit twigs. Then the forest was before them, dark, angry trees looming overhead as if daring Marian to approach. He stumbled, and Strife grabbed his shoulder and pulled him into the forest proper. The darkness was sudden and blinding after the morning light of the beach. The air reeked of dead leaves and old dirt, and branches slashed at Marian's face and arms as he followed alongside the elf. His lungs burned. They both jerked as the chain snagged on a roof. Marian staggered into a tree to catch himself, then slid down the mossy trunk to his knees. Strife snarled and turned back, tugging at the chain. Marian looked up at a flash of movement before them. The snowy white deer was there, sliding out from between two trunks ahead of them. No, not a deer, a hala. That was what the Dalish called them. The hala looked at Marian, his breath heaving and his leg throbbing from the shackle, and then at Strife. Then, with a shimmering sparkle of magic, the hala slid into the form of a young elven woman. Breath heaving and his leg throbbing from the shackle, and then at Strife. Then, with a shimmering sparkle of magic, the hala slid into the form of a young elven woman. I love this, callback to Mahariel telling Morrigan that the Dalish have shape-shifting magic of their own. It's a nice special touch. She was thin, and her features were more striking than pretty, her hair cut short and freckles on her face blurring into the Dalish tattoos across her forehead. She wore supple leather trimmed with fur, and she held a bow in one hand, along with a quiver of arrows. What happened to those in shape-shifting form, though? Like, what? I brought you a bow, she said to Strife. You brought me a magister. Yes, your gift is better. You win. Strife tugged on the chain. Where's Thant? She waved a hand, and the root slid back into the soil, leaving the chain free. The Antam used the mind poison on him. Strife sighed, and after a glance at Marian, added, all we could give him was a merciful end. The Antam will pay. The woman's voice was quiet, but Marian felt the air shudder under her anger. I'm not a magister, he said. I am a mage, though. My name is Marian. No key? She asked. Marian blinked, then realized she was looking at the shackles. None, said Strife. I don't suppose your magic can get us loose? The elven woman squinted. The tattoo on her face made her look like she was glaring, or maybe she was glaring. No, you could cut off the Magister's foot. Then you'd only have the chain to worry about. Irulan, thinking smart. I'm not a Magister, you stupid knife. Marian broke off as Strife cuffed him in the back of the head. Play nice, Irulan, Strife said to the elf, smiling. Play nice, Irulan? What the fuck? Marian just, cursed at her. Yet again, this double standard. He keeps the foot for now. I don't know why. I don't know why you don't just cut off this bastard's foot. I can hide your trail, the woman's, apparently Irulan, said. No, you need to go. Strife pulled out the paper he'd gotten from his friend's tunic and passed it to Irulan. The Qunari are moving into Ravain. You need to get word to the clans before they land. Irulan looked at Mirian with her maybe glare, then back to Strife. I can be there and back by midnight. Can you stay ahead of the Qunari until then? In this forest, with a smile, Strife patted the nearest tree trunk. I've no doubt Mirian and I will lose them. Dareth Shiral, lass. Bring back a lockpick if you've a mind to. Dareth Shiral. Irulan turned to glare at Mirian. I liked that. I like Strife, too. If the Qunari get in because of you, you'll lose more than a foot. For a moment, Irulan reminded him of the old mage who had trained him in combat magic back in university. None of his barriers had been good enough, and his fire bolts had been perfunctory. Her face was scarred from fighting with the Qunari, making her scowl even worse when she ordered Mirian to stay late for more practice. He had hated her with a burning passion until the day he saw her sitting by the fountain. She was crying, holding a letter whose wax seal marked it as coming from the front lines of the war. He had not liked her after that, exactly, but he had stopped complaining about staying late for more practice. Okay. The war they are discussing is primarily in Saharan. And the people who are at the real disadvantage of this war are just the natives of Saharan, who are caught in the middle between two invading forces trying to take over their communities. I feel very little, if any, sympathy. No, I really don't feel any sympathy for these Tevinter invaders who are just still colonizing. You're assuming, somebody beloved person died while they were fighting, trying to take over more land. How pitiful. Marian pushed himself back to his feet. His legs were shaky and his breath was only now coming back, but he had met the elf woman's glare. If the Qunari get him, it means I'm already dead, so your threats are empty. Are you going to get moving, or are you going to stay here and waste time glaring at the Shem? She wasted another moment glaring at the Shem, and then the air around her shimmered with magic. A moment later, a falcon hung in the air where she had stood, and with a quick beat of its wings, it was darting through the forest and up through the branches and away. That went well, Strife said after a moment. He looked back, and Mirian heard shouting behind him. Ready to run? Now. Inside foot, outside. Inside, outside. I need to take a real quick break because I need to refill my drink. My throat is killing me. I'll be right back. All right, I'm back, and thank you for the compliment, Cassandra the lesbian. All right, where were we? Yes, the break. The Antam had sent the Huntmaster to the Bastard just a days ago, after the fall of Ventus. Bastard did not think he needed a Huntsmaster. He worked for the boss like the clumsy, lazy animals they were, so that even those who did try to flee were too weak to make it far. The Huntmaster had offered no further explanation with the written order, and Bastar had assumed it was another small sign of disorganization in the invasion. Usually the other Khanori were there to support the Antam, the workers crafting the gear and managing supplies, the Tamasaran priests making sure the Antam were healthy in mind as in body, the Ben Hasrat spies scouting behind enemy lines and removing any Antam who might forsake their training and abandon the Kyun. This time, the Antam had attacked the boss of the south without the blessing of the other Khanori, and little things were not working as well as they should. I feel like this is something important to note. It is not even the full Kyun who are invading, it is just the Antam who chose to do this. I do wonder if we'll get to see more infighting, more Khanari infighting in the Veilguard, because I feel like this could lead to something significant. And I do also think it's important to remember that, like, the Khanari are not, inherently evil, beings. Like, yes, they want to spread the Kyun, but the Chantry does the same thing, and the Chantry are not treated as these evil monsters, so. Supplies were late. Ships were not in good repair. As he walked out onto the beach where the Huntsmaster stood, Bastard growled to himself at the treachery of the other Khanari. Had they been here to support the Antam in bringing death to the boss of the south, the two prisoners would not have escaped. Bastard would find a prisoner to beat later. This is also probably why the rest of the Khanari aren't supporting the invasion. They do not want death, they just want to convert everyone. So, for all Bastard is saying here, fulfilling the Kyun, he is clearly acting out his own cruelty and just using the Kyun to excuse it. The Huntsmaster carried a bow that stood as tall as a human, as well as a wicked spear longer than the Huntsmaster himself. He had an arrow nocked in the bow now. Bastard did not see at first what the Huntsmaster was aiming at, and then, squinting down to the beach, he saw a black gull pecking at a dead crab. The Huntmaster held his great bow at full draw as Bastard approached. While Bastard ordinarily thought little of scouts and hunters, he had to admit that holding such a bow drawn for so long was still an impressive feat. It is also a good way to ruin your bow. Still, will you kill it? He asked in the proper language of the Kyun as he came up behind the other Khanari. For a moment, the Huntsmaster did not respond. Then, without turning, he said, "It is no threat. The path of the Kyun does not call for needless violence." Okay, see? Exactly what I was saying. The Kyun itself is not violent by nature. It is, just like any belief system, only violent based on people how choose to use it to justify their own violence. Your arrow is already nocked, Bastard pointed out. The path of the Kyun does not call for wasted effort. Why draw back your bow if not to use it? For a long moment, the Huntsmaster looked at the black gull in the distance. I wished to know whether I could strike a target from such a distance. Slowly, with perfect control of his movements, he relaxed the bow and returned the arrow to its quiver. Bastard glowered at the Huntsmaster. This was why he thought less of the Antam, who did not fight on the front lines. Even the black and white striped vitar that painted the Huntsmaster face was drawn to symbolize sight, finding, rather than battle and power, as befitting the Antam. And now? The Huntsmaster smiled faintly. Now I know. You know nothing, Bastard snapped. You did not kill the gull. To not know something is foolishness, the Huntsmaster said. To know by doing is experience. To know without needing to do is wisdom. Oh, maybe it does tie back into Inquisition. It certainly could. That's an interesting plot thread, Neopho. It was one of the sayings of the Kyun, one of the talky lessons Bastard never cared for. The parts about obeying orders and non-followers of the Kyun getting ground into dust had always been his favorites. This wastes our time, and you are needed, he said to the huntmaster, stifling a growl. 2 prisoners escaped. One may be a mage. We don't actually know when this story takes place either, so it could be, very shortly or even during Trespasser for all we know. I'm trying to think when the fall of Ventus adds up with any other media mentioning that. Actually, now that I think about it, that happened in the comics, if I recall correctly. That took place in 945. So I believe it would be 945 that this story probably takes place as well. Oh, the Veilguard. Yes. I thought you killed all the mages in Ventus, the huntmaster said, even those who surrendered and did not fight. The words held an edge. Without the Ben Hasrath to interrogate the mages and discern which ones could be trusted, we had no choice but to administer Kamek to all of them. Bastar smiled. That, at least, was the benefit of the Antam acting alone. No Ben Hasrath to say, no, this mage should live. Do not hurt them more than necessary. This one hid his nature and acted as a normal boss. How much Kamek did you give the mages? The huntmaster voice was calm now. A mountain lake on a windless day. I also want more information on the nature of Kamek. Like, how did dosages work? Like, is it how much often? How often you need to repeat it if it's only done in half measures? Like, I'm too curious about this. We have no Ben Hasrath to measure it for us, Bastar said with a hard smile, so we had to give them heavy dose to be sure. None of the Sarabas or the other troublesome prisoners will ever come back to their minds. Another benefit of no Ben Hasrath, they always preferred halfway measures, shackling a man's mind when it was so much easier to simply break it. I had heard of your work in Ventus, and now I see that it is true. The huntsmaster did nod to Bastar in respect, one follower of the Kyun who knew the truth of another. I will follow the fleeing prisoners. Your 12 most devoted warriors will come with me. My 12 most devoted warriors and me, Bastar corrected, and smiled broadly. The boss will learn what it means to disobey me. It shall be done as you order, the huntmaster said with a small nod. And though the huntmaster may have been weak by the standards of the Antam, a hunter and tracker rather than a real warrior, Bastar saw that the other Qunari had a little smile on his face as well. Behind him, far in the distance, the gull shrieked once and then flew away. Strife moved through the forest, his steps quick and assured. Beside him, or more often behind him, the idiot magister huffed and thrashed and stepped on every damn dry leaf the forest saw fit to put before them. There were other noises, too. Sibilant whispers that curled through the branches overhead, tiny crackling breaths of something huge just out of view. Arlathan was like that. Strife had once called it haunted. Irulan had said that the spirits remembered once had once been. Up ahead, something moved on a tree branch, silhouetted against the sunlight so that he couldn't see it, only the suggestion of a shape. Strife pulled an arrow from his quiver and raised his bow without showing his stride. Whatever it was slid back into the shadows. Trouble? Miriam grasped behind him. Strife slid his arrow back into the quiver. Don't let it worry you. Concern for my feelings, Nightfear? Concern for the spirits of the forest that can feel your moods, Strife snapped. I know I belong here, so they leave me alone. With all your fear, you might be as well as leaving a trail of fresh blood to bring something dangerous our way. So don't let it worry you, Magister. Marion huffed. I've been guarding my thoughts from demons since I was 14 years old. Took a test on it and everything. A desire demon took the form of a boy I liked. The spirits of Arlathan are older and more powerful than the little wisps your teachers summoned to test you. I just hope you're better with spirits than you are with the forest. I'm better with anything than I'm with the forest. Miriam glanced at the bushes. I managed to get lost in the gardens of Benrauthos once, fell into an ornamental pond. I couldn't have ended up chained to a magister who likes hiking. Strife let it go. The man was a mage. If he had said he could deal with the demons, Strife had to trust that at least. I wouldn't trust Miriam for fucking anything. Yeah, diversity ran. The racist slave owner is homosexual. Yeah. Miriam is the worst, and the fact that he is queer does not excuse how awful he is. They kept going. Besides Strife, slow but steady, the mage kept moving, muttering something under his breath in a low chant. So much muttering. Strife thought it was magic until he caught the words in time with their step. Inside, outside, inside, outside. When the shafts of sunlight snaking down through the gaps of leafy ceiling told him it was mid-afternoon, Strife raised a hand and stopped. Miriam staggered forward a few more steps, yanking against the shackle in Strife's left leg, and then got the message and sagged against a tree, gasping for air like he'd been the one half strangled a few hours ago. Have they given up? The mage asked, panting. I can't very well tell with you wheezing over there, can I? Strife snapped. I take it you let your slaves do most of the running? Miriam made a rude gesture and closed his eyes. After a moment, his breathing slowed. Strife shut his eyes as well and listened. The leaves shifted in the wind. Off in the distance, something chased its prey on too many legs. A bird pecked at the bark of a nearby tree, hunting for bugs, and behind that, the clank of metal. Gillinan, guide my steps, Strife murmured, and then looked down to Miriam. Break's over, Magister. Time to climb. Climb? The mage looked at him blankly. The Canari are behind us. Strife strode to a large tree with low-hanging branches, pausing so that Miriam could catch up. I need a better vantage point to know whether they're stumbling around blind or on our trail. So, as a kid, I loved climbing trees, by the way. I'm with Strife on this one. He grabbed a branch and pulled, catching the rigid bark beneath the slippery moss with an expertise born of long practice, and bringing himself up onto the branch with a smooth movement. Climb. The mage followed, ungainly and awkward. Strife took it slow, and still had to descend a bit lower at his leg a few times so that the mage could keep up. It took them several minutes to reach the upper branches, a climb Strife normally could have made in seconds. The mage's clothing was torn and littered with twigs by the time he made it. It was worth it for the view, though. Here in the highest branches, Strife could see the trees below, and off in the distance, not far enough, still, the forest edge and the misty clouds that marked the ocean. And before that, glinting through the branches, the shine of metal in the trees. It was a straight damn line between him and the edge of the forest. Blast! Strife eased back down, and Miriam followed, his fingers scrabbling at the moss. They've got a tracker. Their huntmaster might be worth his name. You told Irulan you could lose them, the mage said with an accusatory note. He slipped a little, dropped hard onto the next branch. The train pulled a taut between them, and Strife grunted and dropped down as well. Well, I didn't know their huntmaster was any good now, did I? He muttered back. He slid nimbly down to the next branch and then dropped to the ground. This time the chain yanked on Miriam's leg, and he fell from this branch and landed hard in the mud. Idiot. The mage's heart didn't seem to be in it, though. What now? Virasan, Strife said, the way of the arrow. Be swift and silent, strike true and do not waver. It's a hunter's saying, but in this case, we're the prey. There's a river a few hours away. We'll lose the huntmaster there. Miriam pushed himself back to his feet. When you are, knife ear. Like, why are you still saying this, buddy? Why are you still saying this? We're supposed to interpret them as starting to get along, and Miriam is still using an in-universe slur. Strife started up again. Inside, outside, inside, outside. He heard the mage still muttering under his breath with each step. He was slow, but he didn't give up. The chain danced between them, jiggling with every step. What's that saying from? He gasped a while later. The bit with the arrow? Vir Tanadal. A wall of heavy foliage blocked the path ahead, and Strife gestured for them to head left. The way of the three trees, wisdom passed down from the goddess Andruil. Right, the elven gods, Miriam smirked. Lot of good they did you. Fucking hell. Oh my god. Now we're like back in the Temple of Mythal again. We might as well be. Strife shot him a glare. If we get out of here alive, it'll be because of what Andril taught my people. Marion opened his mouth to fire something back, and Strife shouldered the mage into a tree. The man sneered the moss as he staggered against it, which would make tracking them easier, but the huntsmaster had already tracked them easy enough. Be careful how you speak of the Lady of the Hunt while you stand in her forest. Marion glared and shoved him back. Fine. That must be why the Elven Empire is the greatest in the world today. Fuck off! As Strife's hand clenched into fists, Mirren raised his hand, and fingers crackled with lightning. Oh, wait! Tevinter overthrew the elves, established the largest empire in the known world, and held off the savage Qunari for centuries because we know how to wield power instead of letting it run in a damned haunted forest. I hate this character so much. I hate him. He's the worst. He is so unlikable. It's like Wix took Michel de Chavannes from The Masked Empire and just turned the dial way up and said, oh, you hated Michel? I'm going to make you even more furious. Strife laughed. You did it on the backs of slaves, Shem. Elven slaves. Like, thank you, Strife. He wanted to punch the glare off the mage's face, but he leaned in instead, and the Qunari are stomping all over your great empire as we speak. He stepped back, then turned and started walking, yanking on the chain. Come on, break's over. That whole scene, oh my god. They moved in silence after that. Just cut off this guy's foot. Be done with it. It was nearing sundown by the time they reached the river. It was about 50 paces across, dark water foaming wide around the rocks, shallow enough that they could walk instead of swimming if they were smart about it. Come on, he pointed at a bit of frothing white. We use the rocks under there. Marion pointed at a chain of rocks a bit upstream. Why not there? Because the huntsmaster's behind us, Strife started moving, and the mage came along rather than tip both of them. Walk on the dry rocks, and he'll spot the muddy prints from your sandals. Walk on the water, and it'll erase any marks we leave. The river wasn't too cold, a small blessing, and Strife picked his way across, moving from stone to stone and keeping them in the shallows as much as possible. When he was halfway across, he changed direction, moving them upstream. Why the change? The mage asked, raising his voice a little over crash of the water. They'll be expecting us to cross directly, Strife answered, or go downstream, since it's easier. He looked up at the afternoon sky. Even if this doesn't lose the huntmaster, it will buy us some time. That makes sense, the mage said wearily, like a peace offering. I'm sorry, what? I'm sorry, a peace offering? At this point, the only peace offering I'd want from this Marion is fucking death. Strife paused as the chain snagged on a rock. He tugged it free and made his way further upstream, the mage behind him. When he thought they'd gone far enough, he went a little farther, because moving upstream always felt farther than it actually was, and then he looked for a likely spot. When we come out of the river, he said, we need to leave as little trace as possible. Muddy footprints, broken branches, all that tells them right where to start looking for us again. How do we get out without leaving marks? The mage asked. Strife squinted. There. He pointed at a large rock at the edge of the river. We climb onto that, then hop onto the little one next to it, and from there onto the fallen log. The log didn't even have any moss on it. What about our muddy footprints? Strife smiled. I imagine the river's done a better job washing your sandals than the slaves you're used to. We'll relieve the water, but it should dry off quickly enough in the afternoon sun. Marion glared, then looked at where Strife had pointed. There's sand and mud all around those rocks. One slip, and we'll leave prints even a blind man could track. Then I suggest you don't slip, Strife said, starting for the shore. They reached the large rock, which was orange and flat and hung out over the river like a balcony. Strife hopped up easily enough, at least most of the way, and then fell onto his stomach when the chain went taut. A moment later, Marion climbed up, huffing. Right, Strife got to his feet and offered the mage a hand. We move together, Magister. Marion took his hand, and Strife pulled him up to his feet. He pointed down at the next rock, a wide speckled one that would be just large enough for the two of them to stand on together. Ready? Marion grunted, and they jumped. Strife made it easy enough, and then Marion landed and bumped into him, and he pinwheeled his arms, standing on one leg on the very edge of the rock, and looked down on the wet sand, just waiting for him to land and make an enormous mess. The mage's arm clamped down on his shoulder and hauled him back. Clumsy oaf! I'm the clumsy oaf? Strife resisted the urge to punch the mage. Instead, he pointed at the fallen log, then the wall of the dark forest ahead of them, tantalizingly close. On 3, we jump for that. Try not to wave your arms around this time, Magister. 1, I'm not a Magister, Marion muttered. 2. Just before Strife would have said 3, an arrow punched into his back. As the elf cried out and fell, Marion turned, trying not to gloat about not being the clumsy one, tripping all over everything in the damned forest for a change. Then he saw the arrow sticking out of the elf's back and also out his front, with blood already pooling below his ribs on his left side. And then the elf landed in the mud and rolled, and the chain went taut and yanked Marion off his feet. He landed on the rock with a jarring impact and, looking up at the sky, saw an arrow flash through where he'd just been standing. Groaning, he sat up. The Qunari had reached the river 100 paces downstream. There were at least a dozen. The huntsmaster was there holding the bow, standing tall and already knocking another arrow. Even at this distance, Marion recognized his black and white painted face. Beside him, the bastard's golden painted face lit up in a savage smile, and he raised a massive axe whose double-bladed head was bigger than a dinner plate and twisted with cruel barbs. Just a side note to any aspiring writers who may be listening to this, please stop using the word savage to describe ethnic minorities, even if they're just coded as an ethnic minority. Especially, this is not inherently the case for Qunari, but especially if those are indigenous or black characters or coded characters. It is a slur. Like, it is an actual literal slur. Boss, he shouted, you run fast, but the Qun leads us to you. This bastard does not lose those in his care. An arrow glanced off his rope-knotted armor, and he roared in surprise. Marion looked over at Strife. The elf was already up, the bow Irulan had given him still thrumming. Care for that, bastard? Strife yelled, his voice steady despite the arrow sticking out of his gut, and then ducked down as the huntsmaster's next arrow buzzed past his head. Get behind the log, Marion hissed, pulling in the magic to him. The magic of the woods was slick and dangerous, heavy one moment and then leaping the next. Marion had cast spells in places where the veil was thinner before, letting the magic come to him with little resistance, but this was different. Something else lurked in the edge of this awareness. He ignored it for now, focusing the magic. While the huntsmaster and the bastard held back, the other Qunari were coming at the river, thick swords and large shields held up over their heads. Marion released his magic, and a bolt of lightning sizzled from his hands. It wreathed one of the Qunari in crackling tendrils of lightning, and then darted across the water to his comrades, jolting them all into a dance of pain. For Jessica, he murmured, letting the anger focus his mind. I'm sorry, but is this supposed to be badass? I hate this character so much. Literally everything he does it annoys me at this point. I don't care. Then Strife slammed into him, knocking him down just as the Huntmaster's next arrow hissed past them. You mentioned the log, Strife said, his voice taut with pain. Marion scrambled back to his feet, inside, outside. Together they scrambled over the log and then hunkered down behind it. How's your back? It won't be what kills me. Break off the arrow anywhere above the fletching, would you? Strife, you should know better than this. Marion grabbed the arrow, trying to ignore his revulsion at the sight of it sticking out of the elf's back, and snapped it. Done. Now what? Hang on, Strife took a breath, then reached down to his gut where the arrow had protruded. With a quick motion, he pulled it through and out, and then released a ragged breath. No, why would you do this? You should never do this. Seriously, please look up what you to do if you get stabbed or if you have like some kind of penetrating sharp object stuck into you. Like they always say, do not remove said object until you get to the hospital where you can get immediate care because you may bleed out and or disrupt something further by dislodging the object. When this happens in fiction, it really annoys me. Andrew's tits. That was Strife, not me. Just clarifying that. I know I'm kind of blending commentary and reading together. Just wanted to clarify that I did not just say Andrew's tits. Tits, Strife did. Marion was very nearly sick, but Strife could keep steady after doing that. He could keep steady after watching it. Should we run? Strife threw the broken arrow aside, knocked one of his own, drew back his bow, and fired. One of the Canary in the river fell, clutching at his throat, and Strife gave a grunt in satisfaction. I had 20 arrows. I'd rather not die with any left in my quiver. Marion nodded and pulled the magic to him again. It was still easy, but the sense of something else was stronger this time. Something lurking at the edge of the veil, sensing him pulling at the magic threads. Again he ignored it, and this time his bolt of lightning sent 2 of the Canary soldiers in the river down into the water, their limbs spasming. Wisp darts and iced wine. The little pastries they served at the cafe over the hill overlooking the docks, the ones with honey and nuts baked into them. All of that had died with Ventus, and the Canary would pay. An arrow sank into the log a handbreadth from his face, and he stared across the river and saw the Huntmaster looking directly into his eyes. The Canary's eyes were cold behind the black and white stripes, showing a calculating intelligence as he drew another arrow. You are weak, boss, Bastar shouted. He was running along the riverbank, waving his axe and smiling his horrible meat-chopping smile. The Kyun will teach you obedience. Strife loosed another arrow. This one snagged the rope knot armor and pinned Bastar to a tree. I've had 50 years to learn obedience, bastard, he called back, his voice a little ragged now, and stronger men than you have tried. I want a Strife backstory so badly. Why couldn't this story just be a Strife backstory and no Marion? Then he grunted in pain as the Huntmaster sent another arrow clean through the log and into his arm. Marion raised his hands. If the veil was thin, it was this time to see how much he could really do. He pulled across the veil, drawing as much power as he could, and the forest roared in anger. Marion's spell fizzled into nothingness as a massive form of wood and stone crashed out of the forest. This thing is so fucking cool. It was as tall as a golem, and it walked on 4 wooden legs bound to stone feet covered in runes and moss. Its body was stone covered in vines, and 2 great wooden arms rose up, each ending in a blade of thick metal whose edges glowed with lyrium. Dumat's breath, Marion swore as the thing crashed towards him. He read another spell, but Strife's hand slapped his shoulder. No magic. It's a forest guardian. I wonder, are we going to encounter these things in the Veilguard? And when he says forest guardian, is this something different from a Varteral, or is it just a Varteral of a different description? I really don't know, so I'm curious to find out. The elf pulled him back, and they both gave ground, stumbling. The chain snagged on a root, and Marion fell, landing on his back. Beside him, Strife swayed where he stood, but his hands were steady as he held them up before the thing. Andarana Tishan! Andarana Tishan, damn it! This is supposed to work! Another arrow sank into the tree beside Marion, and he glared at the Huntmaster downstream, then back at the forest guardian. I can't fight it without my magic! The Canary warriors were closing in now. Before long, they'd have Marion and Strife cut off from any retreat. We shouldn't have to fight it at all. Andaran Atishan! Marion looked at the Huntsmaster, who had another arrow knocked already. Perhaps we don't have to. He yanked the chain free, grabbing Strife, and pulled him to the left, putting the massive forest guardian between them and the Huntsmaster. Inside, outside, inside. Come on, damn it! Past the guardian, he saw the stripes painted around the Huntsmaster's eyes twist as the Canary glared and lowered his bow. Listen, you stupid pile of rocks, I'm not here to fight, Strife shouted at the guardian, scrambling back to his feet. The guardian raised a giant blade arm, and then paused as one of the Canary warriors struck it from behind. The Guardian's reaction was immediate. It stopped, rotated, and turned to the Qunari warrior, whose blade was still raised. It was a big, thick blade, large enough to chop a Bronto in half with a single blow. Unfortunately for the Qunari, the Guardian was larger than a Bronto. The Forest Guardian's arm blade slammed down and chopped the soldier in half. Good. Kill each other, Mirian muttered, and turned to Strife. He was pale, his eyes glassy. Come on, Knife Ear, you're going to give up before I do? Strife eyes focused, and he glared. Not likely, Magister. Inside foot, outside. Inside, they ran. Why does this story pretend to compare the term Knife Ear to Magister? One is a slur, and one is just a title. Once they could no longer hear the fighting, Strife collapsed so that Mirian could get the arrow out of his arm. You're sure I should take it out? The mage asked. No. No, you shouldn't take it out. I can't shoot with it in, that's for certain, Strife grunted. Throw a log. Andrul, that's a strong bow. What I could do with a bow like that. The wounds were clean, seemed clean anyway, but he'd lost a lot of blood. Do you know any healing magic? He asked, rolling onto his stomach. A little. I was better with lightning. Mirian pulled the arrow from Strife's arm, and Strife grunted, refusing to let out anything more. He hoped the darkness hid the pain on his face. I had a friend, Jessica. She worked with spirits. Once she reattached a man's hand after it had been chopped off. Holy shit. That's more intense healing than we've heard of before. She sounds like a powerful mage. Not powerful enough, Mirian sighed in the darkness. I saw her back in the tent. Strife thought about that for a moment. Then you gave both her and Thant some peace. She taught me a few tricks, Mirian said, voice quick and businesslike. Maybe I can close your wounds at least. Is it safe to use magic now? The Forest Guardians are rare. I'd be surprised if there were another within a day's walk. Strife felt a humming warmth seep into his back, and he relaxed a little. Thank you. Fuck off. I wouldn't be thanking this bastard. He heard cloth ripping behind him. I'll see if I can bind it. Oh, I wonder if Anders could, heal that extreme. Because Anders is supposedly a natural spirit healer, so... As long as I can still use my bow. How many arrows did he have left? 18? 19, maybe? How's the arrow you pulled out? Still usable? Would you like a scented pillow to lie on as well? Mirian wrapped the makeshift bandage around Strife's stomach, looping it under his arm. That's more your style, Magister. Strife winced as the bandage tugged tight. You're not bad at this. Had to bind up your slave after some blood ritual? I don't even own slaves, you knife-eared idiot. Okay, fine. That doesn't change the fact that you straight up defended slavery earlier, asshole. Strife turned, raising an eyebrow. What kind of magister did I end up shackled to? I'm not a magister. Mirian glared, his eyebrows about the only thing Strife could make out in the darkness, then sighed and shook his head. Magisters come from important family. My family were slaves. Then you should fucking know better than to be such an asshole about enslavement. Imagine if Fenris just turned around and said actually slavery is justifiable. I only became a citizen because after my magic came, the owner of the factory where we worked adopted me into his family. He swallowed. I am nobody. You know the glowing lamps in the streets of Ventus? I light those with magic. That's my job. Strife stretched carefully. He'd be able to shoot. Can I tell you a secret? He got back to his feet and found them steady beneath him again. I grew up in an alienage in Starkhaven. I thought you were Dalish, Mirian said. I had a big mouth, and it got me in trouble, Strife said, smiling. Hard to believe, I know. I hit a guard who was beating elven children, and he came back with more guards, and I ended up living in the woods. The Dalish found me and let me join up with them. I've picked up what I can from them, but... Mirian started to laugh. You're nobody, too. This is not an all-relatable moment. This is another asshole thing to say, Miriam. Why are you comparing yourself to this guy when you are a jerk and Strife has just, been trying to survive? I shouldn't even be mad at Miriam. Like, he's a fictional character. I feel like this is a choice made by the Weeks to try and compare these two characters as if they are equal. I really, oh my god. Oh my god. Strife grinned. Well, we've only a few hours left, and I've got more than a dozen arrows in my quiver. He looked at the darkened sky. The Canari are close behind us. It's probably too much to hope that the Guardian kills them all. Marion sighed. Your friend said she'd be back by midnight. You think we can stay ahead of them for that long? I don't know, Strife admitted. With my injuries and your complete ineptitude with all things related to the damned forest, Marion finished. Strife laughed. Lack of familiarity, let's say. He squinted, then continued soberly. No, we'll manage for a few hours, but they're going to catch us. Well then, Marion offered him a hand. Let's make them regret it. When the fourth Canari guard fell under the forest guardian's blades, the huntmaster decided it was time to act. As Bastar and his guards hacked at the thing, the huntsmaster pulled away his bow and readied his long spear. He stepped forward, feet light on the ground, pace unhurried, and watched as the forest guardian moved. Its blade swung swiftly, with regular pattern, and he paused for a moment, waited. His spear snaked through the whirling braids of the struck the creature where its neck would have been if it had one, the broad point pinching through the stone. The guardian staggered, and Bastar and his guards hacked at the creature's legs as it turned to the huntsmaster, its blade flashing red in the sunset light. Wait a minute, is that flashing red? Does that mean the lyrium in its, stone is red? Or does that mean the thing is bleeding? Oh, or maybe it's the blood that it's coated in from, it's the Canari that it killed. Okay, that makes more sense. For a second, I thought this thing was red lyrium infected. He stepped to one side, and a blade hissed past. A tiny movement of his spear sent another blade to the side harmlessly. Then he struck again, lunging in with the full force of his weight behind his thrust. His spear punched through the hole left by his first strike, and the guardian shuddered. Whatever magic inside the creature that gave it life, his spear had struck it, and the guardian collapsed, arm blades still twitching. The idiot guards kept hacking at them. Enough, the huntmaster snapped. We must ensure the creature is destroyed, Bastar yelled, bringing his great blade down and shearing off one of the blades. The huntsmaster stalked forward and grabbed Bastar by the shoulder. We would not have needed to fight it had your guards not attacked it. Really, the huntsmaster is being completely reasonable here. This is just another example of Bastar being a freak. Bastar pulled free from the huntmaster's grip. It is an unnatural beast. It is a waste of our time. The huntmaster stared at the log where the mage and the archer had taken cover. This creature is unknown to the Kyun, and our quarry has gone deeper into the forest. He shook his head. We should let them go. What? Why? The huntsmaster turned to the Bastar, whose face was a mask of outrage. This is a flawed hunt. There is too much we do not understand. What do you need to understand? Bastar pointed at where the mage and archer had fled. They are Bas. My Bas. You hunt them, we kill them. One is an elf, the huntmaster corrected. He treads lightly in this forest, despite being captured in the city. This forest carries old magic we do not know, but the elf knows it. We should come back with more guards, plus Ashad, who are better in the woods. Vashidan. Bastar wiped grime from his great blade. As long as I command the prison workers, you answer to me. One of the guards, there were only 7 left, stood before him awkwardly, and he turned and snapped, What? Bastar, the guard said hesitantly. One of our number is too injured to continue. He needs a healer. The huntmaster looked at the fallen guard, whose face was a mask of stoic pain for all the blood that seeped from an ugly stomach wound. A moment later, Bastar's sword cut the injured guard down. Is this the way of the Kyun? Bastar? Huh? Not anymore, Bastar said. Now move. They stomped off after the escaped prisoners, the cowed guards in tow. The huntmaster looked for a long moment at the dead guard, and then he too followed Vastar deeper into the forest. The moon had risen, casting its pale light down through the branches onto the forest below, when Miriam and Strife heard the crash of footsteps in the distance behind them again. They had moved as quickly as they could, the now filthy chain catching in the roots and rocks hidden by the darkness, but Strife's injury slowed him down, and Miriam was too tired to push them any faster. At one point he'd tripped, Strife had hauled them up, and they'd kept going with arms over each other's shoulders. Inside foot, outside, inside, outside. When do we turn and fight? Miriam asked, panting with effort. Just a little further, Strife said. When you see a dead tree that looks like a pointing hand, head left. Got it. They kept moving. The crash of metal on branches grew louder behind them. If this were open ground, Miriam would probably be able to see them if he turned around. How long before they were seen? Ahead of them through the clearing, a small hill loomed, perhaps 10 feet high, mossy and steep. Just in front of it, a fallen tree jutted out, its twisting branches looking uncannily like grasping fingers, with one pointing. There, Strife muttered, and muttered. And Miriam turned to the left. I am going to count how many mutters there are in this story. I will be posting it on Tumblr afterwards because I think it's funny. He found himself scrambling up a natural staircase and made from tree roots. His sandaled feet slipped on the slick moss, but Strife caught him. In a moment, they were up at the top hill, and Miriam had seen before. They now looked down at the path where they had just come from. Now we stand and fight, Strife said. I doubt the Qunari will see the steps in the darkness. Vir Adalen, Strife said, and grinned, his teeth flashing white in the moonlight. Way of the woods. Receive the gifts of the hunt with mindfulness. Normally that means the food you catch and eat. In this case, the gift of the hunt is me knowing about this little hill. This line, by the way, is the one that made me realize there are similarities between the Vir Tanadal and traditional Mi'kmaq teachings. I did write a post about this not long ago. It's just interesting. This is what prompted it specifically. Wisdom from your Lady of the Hunt? Perhaps your gods are good for something. Miriam began to pull the magic to him. It came in fast and strong, with no hint of the danger he'd felt before the forest guardian had come. In his best aristocratic accent, he added, I'll make a note to have my slaves apologize for doubting her. Buddy, you are in no position to joke about slavery. Strife laughed beside him and knocked an arrow. You're not so bad, Magister. Same to you, Knife-Ear. Fucking hell. These lines are spoken as if there's some camaraderie there, but it is still a guy using a literal in-universe racial slur. The same as what he's been doing the entire damn time without any apology or remorse. Fuck Miriam. Fuck this whole story for this broken message of just be nice to your oppressors and maybe they'll be nice back. They still call you slurs, but they'll mean it as a joke, which is totally so much better. Fuck this story. Fuck this story. Fuck this story and everything it's trying to say. I hope Miriam doesn't appear in Veilguard 2. If he does, I will be throwing a fit. The Qunari came into the clearing, and Strife let his first arrow fly. It sank into the guard's shoulder, and he howled in pain and staggered back. Miriam, who let his magic loose, and lightning snaked out, catching a pair of Qunari who collapsed shaking. An arrow hissed past his cheek, and he ducked back, dimly catching a glimpse of the huntsmaster at the edge of the woods. Strife already had another arrow out and flying, and then another, his hands blurring as he loosed his shots. Guards came forward, roaring in anger and pain. Some of them fell, but not enough. Miriam focused, and a cloud wreathed in lightning flickered into existence at the base of the hill. The Qunari inside cried out as tendrils of light coiled around them, and Strife sent another tumbling to the ground, an arrow in his throat. Then a meaty hand came over the lip of the hilltop, just inches from Miriam's face. He leapt back in surprise, and then staggered as a A jagged impact slammed into him, and he looked down to see blood seeping from his right arm where an arrow had grazed him. The hand pulled, and Bastar came up over the edge. In his other hand, he held his massive axe. "Boss," he roared, smiling savagely, again, and ripped Strife's bow from his grasp with a backhanded blow that left Strife on the ground, stunned or worse. "You led us a good chase, but now you see that none escape thee unharmed." It was done. Mirian kneeled down to Strife, who was curled up and unmoving. He grabbed the elf's hand. Now standing before them, Bastar was laughing, and the other Qunari in the clearing were starting to climb. Then Strife, still down, squeezed Mirian's hand once. The pain in his arm made Mirian queasy, but he held on. "Stupid ox man," he snapped, rising slowly to his feet. "You cannot kill me. Look at me." He raised his uninjured arm, sneering in the moonlight with an arrogance to match Bastar's. "How many of your guards did we kill? Do you know what you did when you chained us together, Bastard?" Bastar brought his axe up under Mirian's chin. "What is that, little boss?" "You taught us to work as one," Mirian said, and then added, "Inside foot," and kicked out as Strife did the same. See, "You taught us to work as one" just sounds like a stupid triumphant message. It tastes so much like reconciliation goes both ways, trademark, trademark. We're almost done. I'm sorry. I will be much happier when we get to one of the stories that I actually like legitimately enjoy. Because most of the stories I do really enjoy. This is just not one of them. The shackle that bound Miriam's leg to Strife's caught Bastar just above the ankles, and the big Qunari crashed to the ground with Miriam beneath him, his axe falling away into the darkness. Miriam pushed and Strife had kicked, and Bastar slipped, rolling onto his back as he tried to halt his slide down into the clearing. "Now, the chain," Strife yelled, and Bastar slid off Miriam. Strife leaped over, coming down onto the other side and pulling the chain across Bastar's neck. "Pull!" Miriam heaved as Bastar's weight tore at his shackled leg. The giant Qunari had held his hands up, grasping at the chain around his throat, and Miriam saw his legs kicking freely as he dangled over the hilltop's edge. But it wasn't going to be enough. Miriam's cloud of lightning had faded away, and the other Qunari were already climbing up. They would free their commander and kill him. Miriam scrambled to the soft earth to keep Bastar's weight from pulling him over the edge. All his and Strife's work, all their pain, and it had been for nothing. Bastar gave a strangled shout, clawing at the soft dirt with one hand and the chain around his throat with another. Oh my god, you know how I feel about callback. It's the worst one. It's so bad. No, the worst one actually is Genevieve dies in the end. That one's even worse. I'm sorry, that one's my absolute least favorite. Because it makes no goddamn sense. Callback is boring, but Genevieve dies in the end is just nonsense. Bastar gave a strangled shout, clawing at the soft dirt with one hand and the chain around his throat with the other. A pair of Qunari reached to the top of the hill, pulling themselves up. They towered over Miriam, their axes shining in the moonlight like bones. Then a snowy white owl drifted overhead, a ghostly form in the moonlight. It landed between Miriam and Strife. "And that's midnight," Strife said with satisfaction. The air around the owl shimmered, and then suddenly it was a great bear standing atop the hill. It roared at the Qunari and swatted one of the great claw that ripped through the armor and flesh, sending the Qunari flying from the hilltop down into the clearing below. The other Qunari swung his axe, but the bear caught the haft of the weapon in its mouth and shattered it in its jaws. A moment later, another claw swipe sent the warrior tumbling down into the clearing as well, and the bear roared with all its fury of the forest behind it. "Huntmaster!" Bastar shouted, his legs still kicking as he grasped at the chain around his throat. "Do your duty! Destroy those who threaten the Qun!" "Yes," called the Huntmaster. "That's the idea, bastard." A sudden shocked silence washed across the clearing as the Huntmaster tossed his bow aside. Antam to me, Bastard choked out. I am not Antam, the huntsmaster smiled as the canary beside him looked at him in confusion. In one fluid motion, he swung the spear down from his back and hurled it across the clearing. Bastard shuddered as the spear struck, then went silent and still. Now weaponless, the huntmaster raised his hands, and then, as though they stood as a fancy ball, he placed a hand across his waist and bowed politely, his stoic expression melting into a polite smile beneath the face paint. I am Sarbrak of the Ben Hasrath, he said, and the other Canary scrambled away, turning their backs on Miriam and Strife and the bear as though he were suddenly the greatest threat. You will notice that there is a theme among all the stories in this collection, and that theme is characters who aren't initially who they say they are. I do think it's a nice, pretty tie to thread them together. I heard rumors, he said, walking forward and looking to the Canary in the clearing, that the Antam who took Ventus did not act in accordance with the Kyun. He sounded disappointed. Some of the Bas now call us monsters. He gestured up at Miriam and the others on the hilltop, and they are not wrong. This is what threatens the Kyun. Has Ibala Varad Nihra, he said, as he pulled his spear from Bastard's body. For those I watch, of which I am one. He held his spear loosely, not raised but ready if needed. The bear shimmered in the air and became Irulan, her furs and leather sparkling in the moonlight as she looked down at the Canary. Go and live, Sarbrak of the Ben Hasrath, she said. This is not your place. Sarbrak nodded. He picked up his bow and raised it in a brief salute. I was better with the spear than I was with this. Seemed like a good shot to me, Strife called back, holding his injured stomach. I was aiming for your arm. Sarbrak grinned and placed the great bow carefully back on the ground. Good luck. So Strife gets the bow. He stepped back into the forest with a stern look at the other Canary, and they followed him, heads down and shoulders bowed. In moments, the clearing held only Miriam, Strife, Irulan, and Bastard's corpse. Strife shuffled forward and lifted his leg, and with a groaning clank of metal, Bastard's body slid free and tumbled down the steep slope to crash at the bottom. Cut it a little close, lass. She gave him a look. It is at least 2 hours before midnight. You're lucky I came at all. Strife laughed. Fair enough. I don't suppose you remembered to bring the lockpick. I was in a hurry, she shrugged. We can still cut the human's foot off. Miriam blanched, but Strife just laughed again. Maybe I can shoot it off with this bow he left me. As though you could even draw that thing, Irulan said, rolling her eyes. It's as tall as you are. It may require a bit of practice, Strife said, and limped over to Bastard's massive axe. He lifted it in both hands. This will do for now, then. Miriam, you're going to want to stay very, very still. God, I wish that axe was for his fucking head. Miriam lay back, trying to ignore the throbbing of his injured arm. Not a problem. It took 3 great blows, each of which sent painful reverberations up Miriam's leg, but finally the bolt on his shackle snapped. Strife staggered back, and the shackle trailing behind him was rattling in the grass. He dropped the axe and stretched out on his back. Ah, finally. Miriam stretched his leg, shaking the broken shackle free. Try not to miss me too much. Strife laughed. I think I've gotten my exercise for the day. Irulan, if you wouldn't mind making camp, we can rest up, and then head back to the clan in the morning. What about him? Irulan asked, pointing at Miriam. I know. This isn't my place either. Miriam waved it away. Let me get my arm bandaged and a night's rest, and I'll be on my way. Strife clapped him on the shoulder, the one without the injured arm. You're right, Shem. This isn't your place. But then, once upon a time, it wasn't mine either. Miriam smiled up at the older elf hesitantly. He wasn't sure exactly what the morning would hold, but at least he'd be there to see it. Fuck this story. Fuck this happy ending from Miriam, who is just nothing but a painful, painful experience to read through. And, the story ends here with the implication that Miriam is joining the Veil Guard. Not the Veil Guard, the Veil Jumpers, and that scares me, because it just, like I said, I do not want to see him in the Veil Guard, but all evidence is pointing towards that being the case. But yeah, that is Three Trees to Midnight. Unless anyone wants to, donate at least 50 euros to the cause you're seeing up on your screen for this stream to request a different story, the next one will be Down Among the Dead Men. Even if you don't want to request another one, I would still encourage you to please consider donating, and it doesn't have to be an enormous amount. I know I'm asking a lot for a request, but that's just for motivation. Even if you can donate just a little bit, like, it does all count for something.